I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Chris Lehto, a retired F-16 pilot, UAP investigator, YouTube content creator, journalist at the Portugal News, and CEO of UAPsociety.com. Chris has a bachelor's in materials science from the U.S. Air Force Academy and a master's in aeronautical science from Embry-Riddle University. In addition to writing stories on the UAP phenomena for the Portugal News, he hosts the Lehto Files, a popular YouTube video cast with over 60,000 subscribers. So, Chris, welcome. And let me start by thanking you for your service, sir. You are a former F-16 pilot, trained observer, and recently you've become something of a celebrity spokesperson for the UAP phenomena through your rapidly growing podcast. So let me start out by asking, what got you interested in the UAP phenomena? How did that lead to the podcast? And what have you learned about things since you've started the podcast?
Well, first, Tim, thanks for having me on. I know I tried to come on. You invited me before and I messed it up, so I apologize for that, man. I'm sorry about that. But yes, for me, basically, I retired in 2020 with my family. We live in Portugal, actually, really like Europe. And so we stayed over there and I started making YouTube videos really to kind of impress my kids, I guess. And I love learning. You know, I grew up learning so much from YouTubers like Vsauce, Veritasium, you know, these people that changed my life. And I just thought it'd be interesting to get involved. And so I started making videos basically 2 years ago, this past month. And then no one really watched them. You know, it takes a while, as you know, to really make any sort of dent. And really, it wasn't until I started making videos about the UAP phenomena. I saw the David Fravor interview on Lex Fridman and then on Joe Rogan as well. And since I was a fighter pilot, you know, basically David Fravor kind of spoke the language I'm used to. And it was basically like I was there, you know. So before that, I hadn't thought anything of UFOs really ever. You know, I had the same idea that it's just too far away, the mainstream physics understanding that it's too far, everything's too far away. You obviously can't go faster than the speed of light. So there's no reason there would be any possibility for aliens here. And with David Fravor's account, that kind of just, you know, flipped around my whole world. I had what's called epistemological shock. I found out later where really my paradigm kind of shifted. And so I made some videos about that, a couple of videos. Before that, really nobody watched, you know, I get 100 views maybe. And then Christopher Mellon, actually, he shared one of my videos and it went viral. And I was really, since nobody watched my videos, I was a little loose with the tongue, you know, and I was talking trash essentially about Mick West, because I saw him on TV. And really what I saw is Mick West discounting all these fighter pilot videos, or at least the Navy pilots that recorded these, the gimbal, the Go Fast and the FLIR. In my mind, it looked like pretty amazing evidence, at least. And what I saw from Mick West is just immediately discounting it. And that really just got me kind of fired up. And so I made this, you know, rather fired up video, if you will, and that went slightly viral. So that's how I fell into UAPs.
Well, so you'd mentioned Commander David Fravor and the Nimitz encounters. So also Alex Dietrich and Ryan Graves have come forward to talk about it. And of course, they are both military pilots as well. So what do you think of their stories? And does your experience as a pilot give you additional perspective on what they are sharing in the media?
Yeah, Alex Dietrich and Ryan Graves, you know, I've invited Ryan Graves on 3 times. He said he was going to come on my show, and then he canceled the last minute, which I can understand. You know, same with Chris Mellon. You know, part of me thinks that they are doing their own efforts, you know, and they do enough interviews, to be honest. You know, Chris Mellon has written enough articles, you know, he's given enough speeches to where I can go and find that information now. You know, thankfully to YouTube, there's just so much information out there. So I'm just happy they're speaking out initially. You know, Alex Dietrich, she went on 60 Minutes with David Fravor. You know, that just takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of guts to go out there and say these things anywhere, really. And she did it on national TV. You know, same with Ryan Graves. He's one of the few fighter pilots, the only one I know of on the East Coast that is speaking up about these kind of the box orbs. You know, it's basically a circle, a sphere inside of a square container, and somehow you can, I'm sorry, the other way around. So these square containers inside of a see-through orb, you know, see-through sphere, even weirder, right? If you think about it. So anyway, he's the only one speaking out. I'm very happy he is. I haven't gotten a chance to talk to him, but I'm fine with that, because at some point there's only so many questions, people can ask. And like you said, I can get enough from their answers, specifically because they've been asked so many different questions. So long story short, basically, I'm just happy they're speaking out. I think they're Alex Dietrich and the two other aviators that basically saw that tic tac, man, that makes it so compelling. You have those four people. It's pretty easy to discount one witness, right? You could say David Fravor, maybe he had a psychotic episode, or he had some issues, or he has mental issues, or he saw something, or some weird optical illusion. But now there's four of them in two different observation platforms, two different fighters. And then you even had a third fighter, the actual Marine commander. So he actually saw the water and, the actual cross-shaped water disruption, if you will, go away. So for me, that's multiple observers. And that's really, I think, the most powerful. If we can get video in the civilian sector anyway, if we can't get actual video evidence, it seems like it's very difficult to get real legit video evidence for some reason. So all we're really relying on is, at this point, is witness accounts, for the most part. So I think they have the strongest, most credible witness accounts. I'm happy they're speaking out.
Absolutely. Well, and I know that there is a stigma associated with this, especially in the military, right? And so I think that's worth keeping in mind, is it takes a lot of courage for people to speak out. These aren't just people come forward to tell stories. These are people who genuinely, they feel that it's worth putting their career on the line in some cases, to talk about this. So, I wanted to go to the Intelligence Authorization Act. I'm using Vice as my source online, but, several places have covered this. In the 2023 fiscal year Intelligence Authorization Act, Congress made two startling claims. The first is that cross-domain transmedium threats to the United States national security are expanding exponentially. And that's actually a quote from what they wrote. Cross-domain transmedium threats to the United States national security are expanding exponentially. I don't think that's something that's gotten enough headlines. So based on what you've seen and all the reporting that you've done on this, would you agree with that? Is this phenomena expanding exponentially? Because that's kind of a big word, right?
Yeah, reading through the NDAA, 2023. First off, I'm very excited. I'm very excited for it. Obviously there are dedicated groups of people in Congress, staffers, Congress people themselves, who are listening to these people speaking up, and they're dialing down. If you go back the last several years, each year you can see where the NDAA comes out, right? And it's missing some things, at least, or at least Congress thinks it's missing, because the next year they end up battening it down, So like this time you mentioned transmedium travel objects, and I think that hasn't really been considered, right? At least it wasn't considered much in the last year, right? It was all unidentified aerial phenomena. All we mentioned is aerial. And then it was like, well, what about space? It was like, okay, well, unidentified aerospace phenomena, and then what got me interested, kind of what you are alluding to, I think, is that they added the unidentified aerospace undersea phenomena, so basically they added undersea to the UAP. They made it, they easily could have just said unidentified undersea aerospace phenomena and left it as UAP, right? We could still keep it as UAP, but instead they went with UAUP, unidentified aerospace undersea phenomena. So they added it, someone added undersea to the name of the office. So at least to the name of the phenomena. So I think it's added back in.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that in a little bit, because I think that you've touched on a really important point there. But let me go to the second thing that was in the Intelligence Authorization Act. So they want to, again, quote unquote, distinguish between UFOs that are human in origin and those that are not. So in your mind, I guess the big question is, in terms of the credible reports, right? Because I know there are tons of mistakes out there, and over 95% of UFO sightings are reported to be simple mistakes. I've done research on this in the past. For instance, there was a really great university study that I looked at a few years ago that said that essentially they looked at reports across the United States, And not surprisingly, they found clusters of UFO sightings near airports, right? So lots of people mistake landing lights for UFOs. You know, as the plane comes down, they seem like they hang in the sky. And maybe people are tired, they're not paying close attention, whatever. They see that, they get mistaken, and maybe they end up filing a report. But for those credible reports, does it seem like the performance from what you've read and what you've heard? I mean, does it seem like anything man-made could do that?
Right now I'm researching into alien reproduction vehicles, so it depends, right? What side of the conspiracy do you fall into? Is it not possible, or do you believe that the government has had this technology for decades? If you consider that Roswell could be a real possibility, that there is a possible chance that you had alien craft there, and we came out with some alien reproduction vehicle, what basically Dr. Greer, the Mark McCandlish story, essentially, could it have been redone, right, and re-engineered? And I think if there are aliens, right, if that's possible, if there was a real alien craft, then I guess you extrapolate from that to, yes, it would be possible to have man-made vehicles using this technology, right? That would be one of the main arguments why countries such as the US would keep this information secret. Because if the world knows about it, now all of a sudden you're very, very limited in your freedom of maneuver, right? You can't go and actually capture these devices. If everyone thinks it's crazy, now it's very easy to just roll into Brazil, and just go into Virginia and say, hey, we need to take this, right? Because we know what we're doing. And everyone assumes maybe it's US tech anyway, it's US black tech. So it really gives a lot of freedom to maneuver. So yeah, I mean, it could obviously be man-made. I think it's probably a higher likelihood that most of them are man-made, right? But then there are things like the Phoenix Lights. I did a video 2 weeks ago, and I don't know how you explain the Phoenix Lights. You have over 750 witnesses. The videos aren't that good, but you have so many credible witnesses. The jets were launched, that we know jets were launched. The base went to blackout. We know the base blacked out totally. And yet there's just no mention of it, in any military channels or anything.
Oh,
So
I didn't know that. So the base actually blacked out during the Phoenix Lights.
this is what I talked to Tom King. He was one of 5 main investigators. Yeah, I think they thought they were under attack. There was some sort of mass attack going. They blacked out the base and they launched fighters to intercept these 5
okay.
lights flying in a giant triangle formation, that many people saw. So a giant boomerang shaped craft. I just don't see that being a man-made object, and
Yeah.
the behavior of it is weird. Same with the Nimitz. Is if it was a man-made object, why would it be in that location and for so much time consistently? And then when our fighters do intercept it, it doesn't leave before they get there. It could have easily left, or it seems like they're there. They almost don't care the fighters are there. It's just their behavior. If it was a real reproduction vehicle, then why is it there? If it's a US system, why is it showing itself to US systems and not briefing those pilots beforehand? I'm sure if it was a real system, they would have briefed them like, hey, don't go north, don't look this direction with your radar.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things that I've wondered about, right? Is so if in theory, if these are some kind of black project that the United States has been developing, number one, it seems like our country is probably, I mean, because we are so advanced, it seems like we are the most likely to be the country that's developing these. But I mean, to put something like this into a training exercise, it puts pilots at risk, it creates chaos, it undermines kind of the mission of the training operation for the Nimitz carrier crew. And, it wastes money, it wastes manpower. So, I mean, there are 100 different reasons that you would not want these things mixed up with the Nimitz battle group. So that, that's something I've wondered about, I guess. Now, I did want to ask, you sent me before our podcast, you sent me another story also about a massive UAP over a ship several years ago, but apparently the report was that it was so large that it actually shielded the ship from rain, something along those lines.
Yes, that was Bob McGuire. So Science Bob McGuire. like I mentioned already, the undersea was added into the phenomena, right? They named it. So I think transmedium craft were for me piqued an interest, right? And I'd heard about USOs, especially David Fravor. If you've watched a few of his interviews, he's mentioned there was a test up the East Coast with some sort of torpedo, and helicopters would go and capture the torpedo. And he talks about one anecdote where a giant circular thing came out of the water essentially and grabbed the torpedo and went back down into the depths. You know, if you think of the Bermuda Triangle, all the weird stuff that's happened off that East Coast, and that's where the gimbal is happening, right? If you think about it, off the East Coast where Ryan Graves was talking about it, that area, that warning area, it goes all the way almost to Bermuda if you look at the map. So seeing that, you're like, okay, this is kind of interesting. So the oceans, we know so little about the oceans. And so that cued me. I knew Bob, Science Bob, he'd mentioned something about this on kind of the back channels. I was like, hey, you know, would you be willing to come out and say that story? And so we did an interview on UAP Society YouTube. And his first story was about a submarine. He was on a nuclear submarine in a classified manner. He says he was a civilian. He specialized in listening equipment, right? And so he was on this submarine for classified reasons. He can't say why or when, essentially, but he says that he heard an object pass by, somehow heard, right, on sonar, I'm assuming, going very fast. And then a sonar operator basically ran out of the room and said, hey, you know, did you see that thing going by faster than the speed of sound, you know? That was the first story. And that was picked up by the Daily Star. And so you mentioned here, just hot off the presses today, again from the Daily Star, is the other anecdote that Science Bob said in that interview was he was on the Blue Ridge, is a LLC Blue Ridge. It was famous in the movie, I guess, Saigon, the helicopter, they pushed it off the back. I don't know the scene.
Oh,
But
okay.
anyway, it's a command ship, essentially, a little bit smaller ship, has like the helicopter deck on the back and some basic guns, etc. And he said that they were in the middle of a typhoon, right? He's in kind of the same situation again. He's on this ship operating in a classified manner as a civilian, right? The military brings these people on as contractors. He was there in the middle of this typhoon. He wasn't getting sick, right? But if you imagine there's like 50-foot seas. So he said most of the people around him were actually kind of nauseous and nobody was really looking outside, but he looks outside and noticed a glow. And he noticed that there was no rain hitting the ship, the front of the ship. And he said he could see, like, he said he couldn't see the physical object because it was essentially glowing, but it was like a flat plate, and there was no rain hitting the ship. So he tried to get a better view. He went to another window, saw it again, and then he said it got brighter, the light got brighter, and then it just vanished up. So he said it just flew away up and the rain returned.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, and again, that's I mean that sounds massive. And these are all things that you're covering on the Lehto files. And again, I'll put a link into that. But that's a YouTube channel, and you're adding videos almost daily. So you're definitely covering this in depth. Now I wanted to touch on the All Domain Anomaly Reporting Office, unless they've changed the name again because they keep changing it. So as I understand things, this was created by renaming and expanding the scope of the Airborne Object Identification and Management Group. You know, yeah, I know we've got so many acronyms here, right? It's impossible to keep track of them. But you know, one of the things that kind of gets me about that was I would say it seems like this is kind of an indirect acknowledgement by the DoD that this phenomena is larger and more pervasive than we've been led to believe in the past, you know, or maybe the DoD has known in the past. I mean, as you've mentioned a few times, the oceans, you know, and water seem to be tied into this. You know, do you think that that's the case? Do you think that I don't want to say the powers that be, that's a really bad term to use, but do you think that the Department of Defense is starting to open up and say, hey, not only is this happening all over? Is that kind of what the name reflects, do you think?
Yeah, and that's really the impression I got from reading the 2023 NDA, you know, which I think will pass. Sounds like it'll pass in a few weeks with no changes. So they really filled in, you know, all of the gaps. When I read through, I couldn't really find anything to like hammer out. You know, it gets into legalese speak that I don't even know. Ultimately, it'll be what comes out of it. But it really seems like Congress is not happy with the answers. and they're trying to get at least the information from everywhere. And I think what they've hit up until now is they say, well, what about before, before 2003 or whatever they were covering with their recent reports? And the UAP task force just came back and said, well, we don't have to cover that. Scott Bray said that, what about Robert Salas? What about Bob Salas? And Scott Bray basically said, well, we don't have to cover that. It's not in our purview. And so they've really widened the purview of everything. So I think they widened it in time. So now it goes back to 1947. They're like, when did Roswell happen? All right, let's go before that to modern times. And they widened everything. So when we talk about where to look, that's basically, look under the seas now. And John Ramirez, he mentioned non-acoustic anti-submarine warfare. Non-acoustic ASW is like one possible means that could be possible for detection. I'm still wanting to look into that, and into space. So supposedly now they'll have under the oceans, in the air, and in space. So that should cover everything. So I think they expanded in all realms, not just undersea.
Yeah. Well, and actually, I'd written that into some of the questions also. I'm one of the things I followed was the USS Kidd encounter. I believe that was near Catalina Island, which seems to be kind of the hot spot for this, right? The Nimitz was located not too far away from that when they had theirs. Now, in the Kidd encounter, and I'm sure that you're familiar with this one, they had what they.
I'm not actually. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah,
so.
sorry.
Yeah, the USS Kidd, and I covered this in 4 or 5 different. I'd read about this in 4 or 5 different journals. I believe this was 2019. What they reported were what they called airborne drones. They kept using the word drones, and they described them. And basically, these were like orbs, right? So you could visualize these as these glowing orbs that were basically swarming the ship. And
okay, yes, those are the drone swarms by Jeremy Corbell.
yeah,
Okay,
now one of the interesting things too was they went through the logbook of the ship, and they found references to the Mark 87, and somebody did research on this. And it's believed, I could be incorrect about this, but the Mark 87 is basically a grappling rope gun. They fire it to help the ship dock, right? So they pull up to the dock and they use this rope gun to fire the rope so that they can, anchor the ship. Well, so if this was interpreted correctly in some of these stories, they were actually trying to use this Mark 87 to try and grapple one of these orbs. And I guess they unsuccessfully did that. They weren't able to get them. But, that shows how close they were to the ship. And again, there were a number of them reported. And then there's been a lot of discussion about, could this be man-made? And if so, obviously, this is a giant security threat. I mean, this is the United States military, and you have stuff that's basically operating around it, very close to it, with impunity. So now in terms of space, and I'm sure you're familiar with this one as well, Kevin Day in the Nimitz encounters, he'd indicated that the UAP set off what he described as spaceborne ballistic missile sensor warnings as they descended from the high altitude down to closer to the ocean level. So again, that would reinforce kind of what you've said about the space domain.
Yeah, John Ramirez also mentioned that as well. And yeah, Kevin Day said that I think for several days, they were tracking these, whatever, contacts up above 80, 90,000 feet, so basically well into what we would consider space. And that was before the Nimitz engagement. And then what they saw is actually from 80,000 feet, almost like a kind of quantum jump. It would go down to 28,000 feet and then just fly almost like along polar lines or magnetic lines or something at 100 knots, which is quite slow up that high. Normally you need more air, you have to go faster, and then it would go down to the surface. So yeah, I think space, to 28,000 feet, and then they talked about to the surface or even below. So that's really your transmedium threats. And you find that a lot in military. It's difficult to have handover, right? Let's say if something's moving really fast, like across the United States, like I think in terms of air forces, right? Well, if something's moving across the United States, you have certain sectors that would have to track something, so tracking from here, tracking to as it moves across. If it's going very fast now, what is your system? If your system is for commercial planes, you're just going to pick up the phone and call the person that runs that center. But if it's going so fast now, you can't track it. Same thing with the military. If the Air Force, we know nothing basically about underwater. So we'll track something in the air until it goes underwater, and then what's going to happen? I don't know. We'll have to contact the Navy. Well, how do you call them? No idea. So you come across these communication barriers, and I think that's really what the government is seeing is, if this was true, even the information is going to be so squirreled away in such little small pockets of information, small pockets of little cells, that essentially the government probably thinks it doesn't know, but it could actually know, and just not be aware.
Yeah. Well, now, so one of the other things I wanted to ask about, have you been following what Elizondo had called the nuclear correlation? Has that been an area that you've been following at all?
I did. I made 2 or 3 videos on Bob Solis. That's really been the main event, when you talk about him at Malmstrom Air Force Base. And that's what Representative Gallagher, that's what he brought up. And he entered that into whatever evidence or whatever you call it at Congress, right? So now the UAP task force essentially has to answer Bob Solis, right? And Bob Solis, for people that don't know, he was a lieutenant colonel. He retired from the Air Force. He was a missileer. And at Malmstrom Air Force Base, I think in 1967, he basically was underground, manning the missiles when the missiles were shut off by some sort of orange orb, is what was reported at the front gate. And the guidance system was shut off of these many missiles, I think more than 10 missiles. The actual guidance system was shut off through all this radiation, right? They have they're supposed to be able to withstand nuclear impacts, right? You have your missiles underground. The idea is if a missile hits the missile silo, right, it can still hopefully fire, or at least nearby. So those things are meant not to be penetrated. So I think that's probably the best example of the nuclear issue. And actually Robert Hastings, I think he also brought it up, as well as Jacobs. I had another video on so it's all Bob's, right? Another Bob Jacobs. He was actually in the Air Force as well, and he was basically on the West Coast in California. He was setting up a theodolite, a telescope, and he captured during a ICBM test, so an intercontinental ballistic missile test, he captured a UFO, supposedly, allegedly, entering the scene and firing a laser to knock out the guidance of this ballistic missile system. And that's very interesting, because today I was reading, if you look at programs for the Department of Energy or secret classified programs, a lot of them supposedly are for taking down incoming nuclear missiles. So that would be, what would I use if I was a, whatever secret government organization and I was going to use alien technology, but it's very expensive. I can only make a few of these things. You're only going to use that thing in the direst nature. You're not even going to use it to go kill bin Laden. I don't think, you're going to use stealth helicopters. You're not going to use the ARV, the alien reproduction vehicle. But if you are talking about intercepting a nuclear missile coming into New York, I think that's when they pull out the UFO, and so that's what I could see it as. You have a small group who's just holding it secret at all costs, and somehow feeding the information to industry, right? So we get plasma lasers, we get fiber optics, we get smaller silicone chips, battery technology.
And that was the Corso. Essentially that was Philip Corso's story.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I read that in a different story, which is interesting. But yeah, so that's the idea. And really, I think Congress is on the path. Is that true? Is there some secret organization we don't know about, that knows aliens exist and aren't telling the rest of us? And from what I read is they're really fired up to figure it out.
Yeah, well, that would be wonderful if they explored that. I mean, I have no idea what they might find, but now in terms.
Well, one last point on that is Bob Solis. The whistleblower protection in that NDA 2023 is pretty strong, and I believe it's written to have Bob Solis there and Eric Davis. I think you just call those people. If there are public hearings, they're gonna go, and they will have to listen to Bob Solis's account, which is quite compelling.
Okay. So I wanted to touch briefly on the nuclear correlation, and this is mostly for the audience. I did a lot of research into this last year, and I was really blown away by it. The book you mentioned, Robert Hastings, he wrote a book called UFOs and Nukes. And so you can, anyone can Google that. It's on Amazon, UFOs and Nukes. He also has a website where he has many of his best examples. And I use that for research on this. One of the things that I found was actually these reports, I think that we look in the modern UFO era, as you call it. I think Kenneth Arnold is kind of the first major sighting, right? I think that was shortly before Roswell, if I remember right. But believe it or not, they actually had sightings at Hanford back as far as 1945. And then, if I understand correctly, and I still haven't read it yet, but there was the book Trinity by Jacques Vallée, and I believe he was talking about sightings near the Trinity test site, right? And so it does seem like there's a large nuclear correlation. And again, the Nimitz is a nuclear aircraft carrier. The submarines that have reported USOs, those are nuclear powered. So it does seem like there's a correlation there. And when I went through Hastings' book, he'd also said near manufacturing and production facilities, near storage depots, near Navy shipyards where nuclear arms were stored. So a massive correlation over time. And Bob Salas would fit right into that as well.
I do think it may be, though, that we're looking more. You know, you
Yes,
asked at the
yes.
beginning, do you think the threats in that line, it sounds contrived to me. I don't know, you know, where the USO threats are increasing exponentially, you know, unidentified submerged object threats. And I've always said, like, you don't know if something's a threat if you can't identify it. You know, step one of deciding if something is a threat is identify it. Now, if you can't identify it, then the military, we take the perspective that it is a threat, right? If you don't know what it is, treat it like it explodes until you can prove it doesn't, essentially. You know, so I just wonder if it's just that there's where all the cameras are. You know, your nuclear assets, you're going to be watching those like a hawk all the time.
Yeah, and to play the devil's advocate, you know, I'd mentioned that to a few folks a while back, and that they'd said exactly the same thing. They said there's going to be a lot more security, a lot more people at facilities with, you know, nuclear power, nuclear arms, anything of those kinds. So exactly what you're suggesting makes sense.
But I think we need to take a forensic mindset, you know, and actually start gathering data. And then you can actually do statistical analysis, and you can say, okay, with this amount of certainty, you know, with one standard or two standard deviation certainty, we can say this, you know, but as of now, it's just, you know, I don't know. They won't release any of the data. You know, they won't tell us anything. They haven't released anything.
Well, so you touched on the whistleblower protections. Earlier this year, Representative Mike Gallagher introduced an amendment to, again, the fiscal year 2023 National Defense Authorization Act to, quote unquote, establish a process within the government for reporting UAPs and provide whistleblower-like protections. And it sounds like, from what you've said, it sounds like you anticipate this will probably pass then, and this will go into law.
Yes, I'm not an expert, but based on what I've read, kind of same things. This is the final draft, and from what I understand, and I did look at I think it passed quite unanimously. It was 350 to 78 or something like that. So it's popular. I think it's already procedurally basically passed. You know, so I wouldn't bet my life on it, but I think we can count on that being in there. And I believe people are motivated to come out and speak. You know, I've talked to Chris Partel. I know him. He worked at Skinwalker Ranch. I think if they asked him, you know, he would go and talk. So I think it depends how motivated Congress is. You know, how motivated are they? It seems like they're very motivated. So I'm very hopeful to see public hearings in the first quarter.
Mm. Now, one thing I do want to ask is if I read it correctly, and I may not have, but the whistleblower protections do require submitting these reports through approved channels. And of course, that goes back into a structure,
Yes.
you know, and my worry is not about, I'm not worried about Men in Black. I'm more worried about stigma, right? Where, you know, maybe a pilot sees something, they're going to feel uncomfortable reporting that to their boss, because their boss may say, hey, is this pilot fit to fly? And the boss may feel uncomfortable passing that up the chain of command because they have, they have this whole laundry list of real practical concerns. They don't want to distract things with stuff that they don't understand that just doesn't fit, right? Do you think it undermines it having to put this through channels, or is that just necessary to protect national security?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. It's required for national security. And that's the best defense, right? And I agree, we shouldn't be highlighting any of our vulnerabilities. And that's why the military never wants anything pointed at them. They don't want any videos being taken because everything can be analyzed. If you watch my videos, you can zoom in. I find little key points, based on the shape of the background, we can find out exactly where it is. There's a lot of smart people out there, and there's billions of them. And so whatever you put on the internet is effectively given away for free to the enemy. I think that's really how the military looks at it. And so they don't want to give out any information. And so if you give out information that something is man-made, right? If they come back and say, yes, this is man-made, it's a US drone, this is one of our US spy drones. They're not going to say that, right? Obviously, but they're not going to say anything that even allows that to be extrapolated. So, for example, they're not going to say, okay, we know for sure this is not a man-made object. Okay. Well, I don't think they're going to say that anyway, but let's say that they're not going to say that it's a man-made Chinese drone, because that'll highlight that we detected their drone.
Yeah.
So exactly. So anything they say from a military perspective, anything they say, any information they release is not giving them any benefit, right? The only reason the military would release information is for their own benefit, or they're literally just forced to, like someone's holding them at gunpoint or something. It's all routed through these PA channels, public affairs channels. Don't talk to anyone, just tell them no comment, talk to public affairs, because any information released is not beneficial. So I think they do have to have classified ways to report these things. But like you mentioned, that goes back to the initial problem of the government has all the information and is not releasing it to us. They're not sharing it with anybody else. And they're squirreling it away to possibly have it lost forever, or who knows. So I think it's required and just a necessary evil why we'll probably have to get the information on our own in the civilian sector.
Yeah. Well, and Chris, we're almost out of time, but I did want to ask, from what you've discussed today and from everything that's been published by the DoD and Congress, are we in what the UFO community calls disclosure? Has disclosure happened, or is it still happening? Have they admitted that UFOs are real, or really only admitted that something is going on that isn't understood? And if so, is that enough?
I hope not, because it feels really unfulfilling.
Yeah.
I guess their argument, Chris, Lou Alzona's argument is that disclosures happen inside the government. I think the government has stood up and said, I'm an alcoholic and I know there's a problem, right? I think they have said that, but they haven't gone to any of the meetings. They're not showing up. So far they haven't done anything past that. So I think up until now, it's really part of the government realizes there's a problem, and part of it maybe is disclosed within secret channels, but we don't know about that. So as far as I'm concerned, it hasn't happened. Yeah, for sure not. I think it'll happen when they say, okay, yeah, all these things you've been seeing are ours. It's an alien reproduction vehicle, and we found it at Roswell. That I think would be full disclosure.
Yeah. So they'll at some point then they'll start going to meetings, and they'll have a bowl of jelly beans by their bed just in case. So
that's it. That's a hope.
Yeah. Well, Chris, thank you again so much for your time. And thank you as well again for your service. Let me close by asking, the military is saying that something is happening. That much we know. Do you think that someone in government actually knows more than the public has been told? Or is the entire human race going through some kind of a learning process together, regardless of security clearance or compartmentalization?
Well, I think it's probably a combination of both. Because if it is true, then what I believe is that we're surrounded by life. Basically, we would be very common, not rare. We'd be surrounded by life, and in that instance, I think all of humanity would have, some learning to do, right? We would go through it together. If that is the case, then that would mean there is a small group, I think, of people in the government, in the U.S. government, who would know about this, at least know more than you and I do at our level. But chances are, my guess is, my hunch, if that is the case, they would still be in the dark almost as much as us, But I don't know. It's exciting. I hope to find out.
Absolutely. Chris, thank you again so much, sir.
Thank you, Tim.